Hi, do you remember this book? It's called An Approach to the Book of Mormon, and it was written by Hugh Nibley, who was a BYU professor. And down here it says, Course of Study for the Melchizedek Priesthood Quorums of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1957. So in 1957, the men in the LDS Church, sometimes known as Mormons, were studying on Sundays from this book. And basically this book talked about the desert culture that Lehi and his family were in and the people of those times. The women, I don't know for sure what they were doing this particular year, but I know that at some point in that time frame, they had books that came, if I remember correctly, came out every month or so. And the lessons were in there, and they studied countries and cultures, and I'm sure gospel lessons as well. In our church, we are scripturally and culturally bound to be lifetime learners. Learning is very important to us. We don't all do it, but that is what we are about. Learning by study and faith, using the Holy Ghost as our guide, and being on quest to learn things. That's just who we are. Remember this book? Probably not. The Word of Wisdom, a Modern Interpretation by John A. Widtsoe and his wife Leah. John Widtsoe was an apostle, and Leah was a granddaughter of Brigham Young. So you know that this book was written some time ago, and it was actually written in and published in 1937, was the Priesthood Manual. That's 20 years before this one, that long ago, for the men in the church. I don't know what the women were studying at that time, but hopefully it was lessons that Leah had written. She was very much involved in teaching the women of the church how to feed their families in a more healthy way. Before this came about, they had been sent over to Europe for 3 years. Elder Widtsoe was asked to preside over the European mission. And while they were there, they found that the people were very unhealthy, and they called it a crusade to teach the word of wisdom all over Europe. Leah said, children should be fed with at least as much thought as farmers put into feeding their prize-winning livestock. And that's why she spent her time doing that. And while they were in Europe, she wrote the lessons for the Relief Society for the European Saints. So, and then when they got back, they worked on that book for 4 years. Now, I also remember when we joined the church in the 60s, I remember studying in Relief Society about parenting and health and first aid and literature. We had actual textbooks with stories and poetry that we studied over the years. Then in 1998 came this book. This came about when President Hinckley, who was the president of the church and our prophet, and at the time President Monson was his first counselor, who is now our prophet, President Hinckley asked 2 apostles, which were Elder Holland and Elder Oaks, to basically reinvent the curriculum program of the church. They had both, and independently, both been reading the Discourses of Brigham Young. Now, I don't know if they were reading this volume that I happen to have a copy of, or if they were reading the multi-volume work of everything President Young, every address he ever gave. But at any rate, they had studied him. And they didn't know why they felt prompted to do that. And they did it independently. So when President Hinckley asked them to write the new curriculum, they were ready to go. And the whole program was put together with a board, and they worked that out, and we started this in 1998. There were some really interesting things. This was a major change in direction. In the first place, the men and the women studied the same thing here. And I don't remember that we did that before. I think it was different, but I could be wrong. But this was a different one. Also was different in that the material was limited to just a few pages. A lesson was maybe 5 or 6 pages in this book. the teachers of the class were not to go out and get other material from commentaries or any place else. What was in the book was sufficient. It's original source information. It's the actual words of prophets, in this case Brigham Young. And the kind of the normal way for a doctrine teacher in Relief Society would be to study a lot and get a lot of information from different sources. And that was just the way a teacher was supposed to do things. And they felt almost duty-bound to do that. So this was a major change, and it was very, very hard for us. And another change was changing how, well, we also eliminated all the outlying things that we like to study, and we're strictly focusing on the gospel. They wanted us to get very converted. They knew hard times were coming. They wanted us to know the doctrine and apply it. So all these other things now are the responsibility of parents to teach or people to learn on their own. The way this book worked was that we were to study these 5 or 6 pages at home, ponder it, and go to class and participate in a discussion about what we've learned and how we apply it to life and how we apply it in our homes, how we apply it to solving problems and so forth. So the teacher's job went from a major chunk of time in studying, which was good for her, but it went to a smaller amount of preparation, but a bigger challenge in being a discussion leader rather than a lecturer. And the bulk of and the simplification of it made it easier for all of us to learn to be teachers in our home because the job was not quite so big. And I think we've done pretty well at adapting to this program, although it was a hard transition. So if you remember in the April of 2010, April conference, Elder Perry talked about his mother. She was a gospel doctrine teacher, and for quite a few years, and she was the epitome of gospel doctrine teachers. And he said when it was time to prepare her lesson, for days she would have reference material all over her dining room table, and she'd be studying, and she had notebooks that she kept, and she wrote down all the things she wanted to remember and teach in her notebooks. And then when she would go to teach her Relief Society lesson to the sisters in her ward, she could only give them a very small amount of what she had prepared because she had learned so much. But she would always teach her children all that she learned. She would also teach them what he called secular things, and she would also supplement what they were learning at school. She just loved to teach her children. Any good teacher loves their job, and that's why we wanted to make that a little lower so that we all begin to see ourselves as teachers, because we are. It's ingrained, it's built into us. We come here with that need to do that. So now there are no more Sister Perrys in Relief Society, no more Brother Perrys, if that's what they were doing in priesthood. But we are to be the Sister Perrys in our own home. We are to teach our children. We also, the brothers are to be the Brother Perrys in their home. And we don't need to spend days at a time working, but small quests, small seeking of knowledge. We go on a little quest here to know this, a little quest there. Over time, that builds up. And we want to teach our children to do the same thing. Go looking in quest of knowledge. Come back and share with us. Or let's go together and do this. We could have a family quest and all go. In fact, if you were in Relief Society and you got this book, and if you weren't in Relief Society because you had some other responsibilities during that time, you were still invited to have a copy of this book. And the same with the men. And if you had done that every year, you would now have in your library 12 books that have the teachings of the prophets. So, and one where we did a couple of years of just gospel doctrine. So you would have done all these years of teaching, of collecting a library in your home to make your home truly a school. And you could go on a family quest for some subject and assign kids to go to different prophets. There are so many things that we can do in our home. Now, this year, after having in these books, we did not go in chronological order. We started with Brigham Young, who was the second president of the church, and then we went to Joseph F. Smith, who was the 6th, I think, and then we went to the one who was the 11th, and then we went back to the 4th, and we've been all over. So this year, we have this book, Teachings of the Presidents of the Church, Ezra Taft Benson. Interestingly, this is our 13th manual, and he was the 13th president of the church. So at this point now, finally, for the first time, we are chronologically in order. Had we started at the beginning with Joseph Smith, this is where we would be now. So it's good to be in order. But is it really significant that that happened? I doubt it. But there are 2 other prophets that could have been chosen. There were 2 after President Benson who have not been studied yet, who are deceased. And then if the Lord could prompt and arrange the teaching of the first book, the subject of the first book, which was Brigham Young, then I suppose he could arrange that this book be the one we study this year. I don't know. But we do live in a culture that is self-destructing, and the solutions to our problems are first spiritual. And this is a wonderful book. I've read through it. Some of my favorite quotes are in here. I read all of it, but I love this book. The question is, Ezra Taft Benson served our country very well, and he knows our country. He knows what we need. He also, in his serving, for one thing he did that was monumental, he served for 8 years as the Secretary of Agriculture to President Dwight D. Eisenhower. No apostle's ever done that. As a minister of the church, he left Salt Lake and lived and worked in Washington, D.C. for 8 years. And he left us a record of those years. He wrote a journal of that, and published as a book. And he said he did it first because he felt the American people needed to know how their government was run. By the end, he said he had to write it because essentially he was fearing for the future of our country, and he was hoping basically to wake us up. So is this a quest that we ought to take up in our families? Is this, and maybe our neighborhoods? Should we go maybe to the footnotes in this book and search through some of these original sources, some of his conference talks, some of the books he wrote? That's a question we'll take up in the next video. Thanks.